The sun climbed slowly over Lexington Hill, casting long shadows across the marble steps of the state capitol. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, sleek, quiet, understated. The man who stepped out wore a dark blue suit, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. There was a steadiness in the way he moved, deliberate and focused, like someone walking into purpose. He barely made it 5 steps. 2 officers white MID-30s emerged from a patrol vehicle idling nearby. One adjusted his vest. The other tapped a baton against his thigh. They didn't approach with urgency, just certainty. "Excuse me, sir," one said. "Need you to step over here for a quick chat?" The man paused. No panic, no protest. He turned with calm eyes. "Is there a problem, officer?" "No problem unless you make one," the second replied, glancing at the man's skin, then his briefcase. "Just want to make sure everything checks out." In moments, the situation unraveled. He was ordered to place his hands on the car, patted down, handcuffed pedestrians, slowed. One woman across the street fumbled for her phone, recording quietly. A jogger stopped mid-stride, disbelief spreading across his face. "Look a little nervous for a guy with nothing to hide," Officer Hale said with a smirk. His partner Sutter offered no smile, just silence and tightened cuffs. The man didn't argue, didn't flinch. Only the smallest shift in his jaw gave away what was happening. Inside, a struggle not to shout, but to remain intact. His wristwatch gleamed in the morning sun, a subtle symbol of the authority they failed to see. Onlookers began to murmur. One voice said, "Wait, isn't that?" But the officers didn't hear it, or chose not to. 10 minutes passed. 10 long minutes of public stripping, not of clothes, but of dignity. There was no raised voice, no aggression, no threat. Only the color of his skin, and the assumption stitched to it. Finally, another patrol car arrived. A supervisor stepped out, took one look, and froze. "Uncuff him." "Now?" Officer Hale hesitated. "We were just following," I said. "Now?" The cuff snapped open. The man flexed his wrist slightly, then reached down to retrieve his leather portfolio from the ground. He said nothing, just nodded once quietly, deliberately, and walked toward the building he had been trying to enter all along. Room 312, Justice Reform Roundtable. He had been scheduled to speak at 10 a.m. and his name would be on every screen in the country by noon. Who was this man? Why had 2 officers treated him like a suspect? And why had he allowed it to happen in silence? The video would go viral before the hour was out. But the story was only just beginning. By lunchtime, the clip had already been reshared 300,000 times. A grainy, vertical video, no editing, no voiceover, just 10 minutes of 2 white officers handcuffing a well-dressed black man without cause. The still frame of his eyes locked forward became the thumbnail on every platform. Some viewers watched with disbelief, others with a painful sense of recognition. By my mid-afternoon, the man in the video had a name. Judge Elijah Monroe, years in public service, appointed to the state Supreme Bench by 2 consecutive governors, author of landmark rulings on civil rights, criminal justice reform, and sentencing equality, a man who had sworn in officers, mentored cadets, and stood as a symbol of legal integrity. Now he stood as something else, a mirror. The silence across official channels did not last long. At the governor's office, aides scrambled to draft statements. Inside newsrooms, anchors cleared evening slots for live segments. Cable crawls ran the same line every hour. State Supreme Court judge wrongfully detained by Capitol Police. Outside the Lexington Hill courthouse, protesters began gathering, not with anger yet but with candles, with signs, with smartphones set to livestream. Across the steps, one handwritten placard read, "If they did that to him, what chance do we have?" By 4 p.m., the governor stepped in front of microphones. Governor Linda Vargas, known for her strict bipartisan neutrality, looked shaken. "What happened this morning is unacceptable. And it is exactly why next week's summit on justice reform has been moved to this Friday. Judge Monroe will speak. The state will listen." But Elijah Monroe had not said a single word. He remained at home, behind drawn curtains, watching the clip in silence, not just once, over and over. His phone rang constantly. Journalists, colleagues, civil rights leaders, former students, even the attorney general. He did not answer, not yet. In another part of the city, Officer Mason Hale sat in a supervisor's office. His jaw was tense, his hands twitching. "I did not recognize him," he said quietly. He matched a vague bolo behind him. Officer Dana Sutter said nothing. She stared at the floor. But even within the department, cracks were forming. The Lexington Police Training Academy. A group of young cadets gathered in the break room around a laptop. One of them, Officer Riley Chen, fresh from a sociology degree, rewound the clip. He was not resisting. Riley said aloud. They did not even ask for ID before detaining him. "No Miranda, no probable cause," someone added. The room went quiet. For years, Judge Monroe had given guest lectures, their quiet talks about dignity, justice, and the weight of wearing a badge. Now he was the one in cuffs, and the badge had failed him. Director Thomas Wynn, head of the academy, closed the door behind him as he entered the room. "We all saw it," he said simply, "and we will talk about it, all of it." Even inside the force, the incident had become more than a mistake. It had become a question mark, one that bent toward something bigger than protocol. That night, news vans lined the block outside Monroe's modest home. Neighbors stood on porches, protecting his privacy the only way they knew how, by standing in silence, refusing to speak to reporters. Still, the world kept spinning louder. A CNN headline read, "The Judge in Handcuffs: What the Monroe Incident Means for Policing in America." TikTokers posted reactions, some in tears, others in fury. By 9 p.m., President of the State Bar Association, Kareem Douglas, released a formal letter. If a man who has spent his entire life defending the law can be treated like a threat on the steps of justice, then what does that say about the law itself? Yet through it all, Elijah Monroe remained silent. He stood in his study, books stacked neatly behind him, the framed photograph of his late wife on the desk, and a legal pad before him still blank. He did not need to speak to be heard. Not yet, because the world was waiting, not just for a press conference, not just for outrage. They were waiting to see who Elijah Monroe would become now, a man seeking revenge, or a man ready to change the system that had failed him, and they would not have to wait long. The following morning, the halls of the state capitol did not sound like politics. They sounded like breath held in tension. Room 400, the chamber reserved for the Justice Reform Roundtable, had never been this quiet. Staffers murmured updates into phones. Cameramen adjusted lenses. Legal analysts flipped through briefing folders. But no one was really working. Everyone was watching the door. Judge Elijah Monroe was scheduled to speak. His name had not left the news cycle for 24 hours. No public statement, no interviews. Just that one video and the silence that followed. But everyone knew this meeting would define what came next. At exactly 10 a.m., the oak double doors opened. Elijah entered without fanfare. He wore a deep navy suit, polished shoes, and a steady expression. In his left hand, the same leather-bound portfolio he had carried to court for 20 years. He did not smile. He did not flinch. He simply walked. And something extraordinary happened. The room stood. Not by rule, not by tradition, but out of something deeper. Respect. The governor rose. The attorney general, the heads of 3 separate state departments. Even aides and observers followed. No one had spoken yet. But the message had been sent. He was not just a man who had survived injustice. He was a man who still belonged. Elijah gave a brief nod, then took his place at the head of the table. The governor leaned forward and broke the silence. "Judge Monroe, thank you for being here. We are listening." Elijah paused, opened his folder, and began. His voice was steady, calm, clear. "Yesterday morning, while on my way to this very summit, I was detained by 2 officers of our own state police. There was no warrant, no probable cause, no explanation, only a presumption based not on my behavior, but, I believe, on my appearance." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The video is public. It speaks for itself. But I am not here to relive personal embarrassment. I am here because this moment, uncomfortable as it is, may be the most honest test of our system. Across the table, an older councilman lowered his head. A young woman near the end wiped her eyes. The room felt smaller now, more human. This is not about one bad stop. It is about what we tolerate, what we excuse, and what we refuse to see until it is captured on camera and pushed into the light. He looked around, not as a man wounded but as one who understood his purpose. Trust between law enforcement and the public is not built on slogans or statements. It is built on dignity. And dignity, especially for the innocent, cannot be optional. The words landed like quiet thunder. Elijah did not gesture wildly. He did not lecture. He simply spoke the truth. And the truth did the work. The agenda shifted. What had been planned as a procedural update on training standards became something else entirely. Video clips were pulled up on screens. Legal experts were called into the room. Civil rights advocates arrived without invitation and were welcomed. And for the first time in recent memory, the tone in that room changed. This was no longer about fixing something broken. This was about whether those in power had the courage to listen to the man they had once handcuffed and let him lead. Began as a policy meeting shifted into something more urgent, a reckoning. That same afternoon, behind the thick glass walls of the Capitol's lower chamber, the governor reconvened the emergency committee. The room was filled with state attorneys, legislative advisors, and members of the ethics board. The press was held at a distance, but their presence pulsed just beyond the walls, and in the center of it all stood a request no one had expected. The governor turned to Elijah Monroe. Her voice was steady, but the weight of the moment pressed against every word. "Judge Monroe," she said, "we would ask you to preside over the review session as a neutral authority." Elijah's expression did not shift. He did not speak right away. He looked down at the folder in front of him, then across the room at the empty chairs prepared for officers Hale and Sutter. "This was never supposed to be about me," he said. "There must be no perception of bias." The governor's legal counsel stepped in. "We have reviewed the statutes. There is no conflict. Your neutrality and conduct in this matter speak for themselves." A long pause followed. Then Elijah gave a small nod. "Very well," he said. "Let us begin." 2 hours later, the chamber filled. State employees, justice officials, and a handful of community advocates watched in silence as officers Hale and Sutter were escorted into the room. They were no longer the faces of authority, they were men walking into accountability. Officer Hale looked pale, his jaw clenched tight. Officer Sutter kept his eyes low, hands folded, shoulders tense. Gone was the false confidence from the body cam footage. Gone was the certainty of impunity. At the center of the panel sat Elijah Monroe, flanked by 2 senior justices and the state attorney. He opened the session with calm resolve. "We are not here for vengeance," he said. "We are here for clarity, for truth, and for the standards we claim to uphold." The video played again this time, not on a phone screen, but on a large monitor visible to everyone in the chamber. The footage was raw. The voice of Officer Hale asking Elijah to exit the vehicle. The confusion, the refusal to check identification, the handcuffs, the silence. Then came the cross-examinations. Officer Sutter was the first to falter. When asked why he had not verified Elijah's credentials, he admitted, "I did not think it was necessary at the time." A murmur moved through the room. The Attorney General leaned in. "Was there a specific behavior that led you to ignore identification protocol?" "No," Sutter replied. "There was not." Next came Officer Hale. He struggled to defend the stop, fumbling through terminology. He misquoted the legal standard for probable cause. When asked about the refusal to allow a phone call, he cited departmental discretion, but could not locate the policy to support it. Elijah did not flinch. He did not raise his voice, but every word he spoke cut through the chamber like cold steel. "Our job is not to enforce fear," he said. "It is to uphold the law. When discretion is abused, it becomes discrimination." The hearing stretched into the evening. Witnesses were brought forward, some who had been present during the incident, others who had experienced similar treatment under the same officers. Body cam footage and time-stamped logs revealed inconsistencies in the officers' written reports. Hale and Sutter no longer looked defiant. They looked cornered by the truth. And the truth, at last, had a seat at the table. Just before 5 p.m., the panel delivered its finding. Officers Hale and Sutter had acted with negligence, failed to follow established protocol, and violated the civil rights of the individual they detained. The official recommendation, suspension without pay, pending further investigation by the Attorney General's office. No applause followed, no cheers erupted, just a long, heavy sigh, kind that follows the first honest breath after years of holding it in. Outside the chamber, protesters did not shout. They watched as Hale and Sutter exited, escorted by internal affairs. The men did not speak. They did not look up. Justice had spoken without a single raised voice. And Elijah Monroe, he remained behind as the room emptied, the same calm in his posture, the same fire in his eyes. Because this was not about punishment, this was about truth. Finally standing in the light, it was just past dusk when the verdict was read. The lights inside the state hearing room dimmed slightly, casting long shadows across the floor. The panel had taken over 2 hours behind closed doors, deliberating over the actions of Officers Hale and Sutter. Outside, the crowd remained. No one moved. No one chanted. They simply waited. Inside, the air had changed. Judge Elijah Monroe stood. As the panel returned, the room rose with him, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had deepened over the course of this long, harrowing week. Chief Ethics Officer Margaret Duval read the conclusion in a low, unwavering voice. The review panel has unanimously determined that Officers Hale and Sutter acted in direct violation of state conduct, statutes, civil rights policy, and departmental ethical protocol. A pause. The recommended disciplinary action, immediate suspension without pay, referral to the state attorney's office for potential prosecution. There was no applause. No audible reaction at all, just the weight of justice. Delivered with the quiet finality of stone being set, Officer Hale did not lift his head. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, fingers white at the knuckles. Officer Sutter, visibly shaken, murmured something beneath his breath. "I am sorry," but the words dissolved into the silence of the room. No one acknowledged it, because remorse whispered late feels like wind passing through a locked door. The hearing concluded with a final statement read aloud by Elijah Monroe himself. He stood at the podium, the lights casting a halo of gold around his shoulders. His voice was composed, firm, and clear, not as a man bruised by injustice, but as a man unwilling to let it rot unchallenged. This moment is not about a single encounter. It is about a system that allowed silence to become standard. He said, but silence can no longer be our default. Accountability is not revenge, it is repair. And today, we begin that repair. No one clapped. No one dared interrupt him. The speech ended, and still, the room stayed seated, not bound by order, but by reverence. Outside, word spread quickly. The governor's press team stepped aside as community leaders emerged. Protesters, who had stood in the heat for hours, did not raise their fists or shout slogans. They simply cleared a path as Elijah exited the building. Phones recorded, cameras flashed, but it was the quiet that told the real story. A mother held her son's hand tighter, a former police officer in the crowd removed his cap and nodded. Even reporters hesitated to speak too loudly into their microphones. This was not a spectacle. It was something sacred in the newsroom of Lexington Hill Daily. The editor paused before sending the final headline to print. He deleted the word scandal, replaced it with turning point. Across the state, television anchors spoke with measured tones. Tonight, a precedent has been set in the state of South Carolina. A judge, detained without cause, stood before the very system that failed him and asked it to do better. And it did. Not because the public demanded punishment, but because one man demanded truth. That night, Elijah returned home without an escort, without celebration. He placed his jacket on the same hook by the door and sat alone on his porch, watching the streetlights blink in slow rhythm. His phone buzzed. Dozens of messages, hundreds of notifications. He placed it face down. He closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in peace. For once, the silence outside did not feel empty. It felt earned. It felt like change. The morning after the verdict, a different kind of press conference gathered at the state capitol. This time, the air was not tense. It was expectant. Governor Linda Vargas stood at the podium, flanked by lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and representatives from law enforcement. Elijah Monroe stood to her left, silent, composed, deliberate. There were no handcuffs, no headlines about outrage, only resolve. This is not just a response to a moment, the governor began. It is a response to a pattern. And today, we begin breaking it. She outlined 3 sweeping reforms, each more ambitious than the last. First, mandatory bias, recognition, and escalation. Training for all law enforcement officers statewide recertified every 2 years. Second, independent citizen oversight boards in every county, empowered to investigate misconduct beyond internal affairs. Third, free legal clinics funded by the state to assist any citizen who believes they have been unjustly detained or mistreated by law enforcement. That the reporters blinked. Even some members of the legislature looked stunned. These were not symbolic gestures. These were structural changes, unexpected, sweeping, and immediate. Elijah was then invited to speak. He did not bring notes. He did not need them. This is not just about a courtroom, he said. It is about the country we want to be. He looked out at the room, his voice steady. Justice cannot exist in theory. It must exist in motion, in laws, in language, and how we train those we trust with authority. This is not the end. This is the beginning. The words rippled far beyond the marble walls of the Capitol. Within 48 hours, departments across Michigan began internal audits of their arrest records. Law school students volunteered at the new legal clinics, sitting shoulder to shoulder with citizens, seeking guidance. Faith groups opened their doors for Know Your Rights nights. City councils began reviewing body cam policies. What started as one act of mistaken identity had become a mirror many communities could no longer turn away from. Online. The video continued to circulate. But now, it was being shared with a different caption. The day accountability answered. Elijah Monroe became more than a name. He became a symbol, not of anger, not of confrontation, but of a quiet hero who stood firm, spoke without rage, and moved a state toward reform without ever raising his voice. His portrait taken at the press conference was posted on university walls, in advocacy newsletters, even on murals in 2 community centers. Some cadets at the police academy began requesting that same image as a screensaver on their devices. One academy instructor remarked, "They do not admire him because he is a judge. They admire him because he never forgot he was also a citizen." In downtown Detroit, a young Latina officer in training was seen writing the words, "Protect dignity" on the inside of her notebook. And in a public school outside Grand Rapids, a teacher asked her class what justice meant to them. A 6th grade boy answered, "It means not being afraid when you are telling the truth." From cafes to classrooms, from county jails to state legislatures, a shift had begun. The reforms sparked debates. Some pushed back, but no one could ignore what had been triggered. Because once dignity enters the public conversation, it does not leave quietly. It becomes part of the culture, and culture, unlike policy, does not just follow rules, it rewrites them. Elijah Monroe did not give more interviews. He declined magazine covers, but he continued his work behind the scenes, meeting with reform advocates, advising cadet trainers, and helping develop a model curriculum now studied in other states. And every night, when he walked home from the courthouse, he passed the same park bench where the first viral video had been recorded. He never avoided it. He walked by, head high, every single time. And sometimes, when no one was around, he sat there, just for a moment, not to remember what had happened, but to remind himself of what had begun. 3 months later, the sun rose gently over the Michigan State Police Academy. It was graduation day. Rows of cadets, freshly pressed in their uniforms, sat upright under a white canopy. Their families filled the back rows, mothers clutching programs, fathers nodding quietly, siblings with phones ready to capture the moment. But today's final speaker was not from the academy. He was a man who had stood on the other side of the badge, Judge Elijah Monroe approached the podium in silence. No music, no introduction, just footsteps and presence. He looked out at the sea of new faces, eager, uncertain, determined. "I am not here as a judge today," he began. "I am here as a man who was stopped, questioned, and doubted for something that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with assumption." The crowd listened, but I survived that moment, not with anger, he continued, but with purpose. He paused, letting the silence settle. "I want each of you to carry this. Your badge is not a weapon, it is a promise. Not to dominate, to protect, not to silence, but to serve. You do not enforce fear, you uphold dignity." There were no dramatic gestures, no pounding fists, just truth, and it echoed louder than any applause. When the ceremony ended, cadets lined up to shake his hand, some with quiet gratitude, others with eyes full of questions. They were still learning how to ask. One young black recruit, barely 21, with a gold pin on his collar, stepped forward last. He held Elijah's hand just a second longer than the rest. "Sir," he said quietly, "you gave me a reason to stay in this uniform. Thank you." Elijah did not respond with words. He simply nodded. Once outside, the crowd began to disperse. Families laughing, cadets posing for photos, children running between the rows of chairs, their giggles bouncing off the academy walls. Elijah walked slowly to his car, but before opening the door, he turned back toward the stage now empty, and for a brief moment, he just stood there, not thinking of what had happened, not even of what had changed, but of what was possible now. The final image is not a protest, not a courtroom, not even a handshake. It is a classroom of cadets, diverse, alert, into a future shaped by the voice of a man who chose to speak softly, but firmly. Because in the end, justice did not wear a robe. It did not carry a gavel. It simply showed up and stayed.